Hi everybody, it's Mr. Stevens here. We are back again with Son of the Morning Star, Custer and the Little Bighorn by Evan S. Connell. And we are going to jump right back into where we left off in the last video. We were talking about Major Frederick Benteen. So without further ado, let's jump right in. On April 27, 1888, he reported for duty at Fort Niobrara, Nebraska, but 3 days later, he applied for a medical discharge. The Army granted his request because of a bad back, defective vision, and frequent microturation, all attributed to injuries during his period of service. After getting out of the Army, he retired to Atlanta, where he lived in reasonable comfort with his wife and their son, dividing his time between a farm and a cottage in town, writing a few memoirs, enjoying the friendship of such luminaries as Joel Chandler Harris. He himself was something of a celebrity, though regarded as little more than a carpetbagger by the Atlanta nobility. He did not mind talking to reporters, but he would not discuss the great battle. The Atlanta Journal commented that there was nothing he disliked more than publicity, and, quote, if it were left to him, none of his valorous deeds would be handed down to posterity. In 1890, despite his scandalous behavior at Fort Duchesne, he was awarded the brevet rank of brigadier for gallant and meritorious service in two battles, one as thoroughly forgotten as the other is famous, Canyon Creek and the Little Bighorn. 8 years later, on June 17th, he was paralyzed by a stroke. 5 days after that, he died. Among the pallbearers were the mayor of Atlanta, the governor of Georgia, and the vice president of Coca-Cola. In 1902, he was exhumed and reburied in Arlington. Once he wrote to a former 7th Cavalry private with whom he had served at the Little Bighorn, quote, I've been a loser in a way all my life by rubbing a bit against the angles or hair of folks instead of going with their whims, but I couldn't go otherwise. 'Twouldn't be against the grain of myself. The same undoubtedly could be said for Reno, and for the 7th Cavalry Commandant himself. All three rubbed against the hair because they could not do otherwise. So it happened that the 7th's three ranking officers created a triangle with Custer at the apex, while his subordinates held themselves apart at the lower corners. Why Major Reno and Captain Benteen did not get along is puzzling. Their mutual antipathy lacked the virulence that inflamed their relationships with Custer, but in spite of all they had in common, they could not, or would not, march in step. One thing the captain might have resented was the fact that Reno attended West Point while he himself did not, and he probably knew about Reno's miserable West Point record, which must have added to the contempt he felt. Reno was scheduled to graduate with the class of 1855, but twice derailed himself with excessive demerits and did not make it until 1857. During those 6 years, he picked up 1,031 demerits, an academy record. At the opposite extreme, a few cadets have graduated without a single black mark, the most illustrious being, as one might guess, Robert E. Lee, class of 29. Reno got demerits easily, almost deliberately. A button on his tunic was unfastened. A trace of lint clung to the bore of his rifle. He arrived at formation several seconds late. He carved his initials on a tree. While on guard duty, he began to sing. By normal standards, such crimes are not heinous, but Reno was in the Army where normal standards do not prevail. Accordingly, he was busted, saved from permanent expulsion once by the grace of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who himself had accumulated 137 demerits during his 4th year as a cadet. Busted again, barely saved by a reduction of charges, Reno emerged from the nest 20th in a fledgling class of 38. This was not good, but during his career with the 7th, he must have reflected that it was better than the record of his commanding officer, George Armstrong Custer, class of 61, graduated last. Reno's record was also superior to that of his closest friend at West Point, James McNeill Whistler, who piled up demerits with heroic aplomb and concluded one examination by defining silicone as a gas. Whistler reputedly said to Reno some years afterward that if silicon indeed had been a gas, he probably would have stayed in the Army and become a major general. And Reno said, yes, but then nobody would have ever heard of his mother. That must have been one of the cleverest things Reno ever said. Unlike Custer and Benteen, with their very different styles, he seems humorless. There is no levity in that dark face. From the start, almost from the day he entered West Point, he radiates an aura of misfortune. It never diminishes. During the Civil War, when he led a charge against Fitzhugh Lee near the Rappahannock, his horse went down, pinning him underneath. He was cited for gallantry and recommended for brevet promotion from captain to major, but the gods always poisoned their gifts to Reno. The accident resulted in a severe hernia. After the war, he was sent to West Point as an instructor. This ought to have been good news, considering various alternatives, but at West Point, after 8 years as a cavalry officer, he was assigned to teach infantry tactics. Thus far, it sounds like bad luck, but henceforth, Reno seemed increasingly responsible for the necklace of tin cans he wore. He protested the infantry assignment by writing to Superintendent George Washington Cullom. Cullom thought this presumptuous and requested the War Department to relieve Captain Reno of his duties at West Point. He therefore was ordered to New Orleans. Again he protested by writing to Adjutant General, which further blemished his reputation as an obedient soldier. In 1866, convinced that he deserved promotion and that the way to accomplish this was to let important people get a look at him, he visited the capital. Nothing happened. He invoked the aid of a senator. Then he wrote a letter to President Johnson. As a result, having antagonized various parties, including the Secretary of War, he was shipped to Fort Vancouver, Washington Territory, about as far from the throne as a soldier could be sent in those days. During the summer of 1869, he was finally promoted to major in the regular army and assigned to the 7th Cavalry at Fort Leavenworth. So, to the Kansas Prairie he went with his wife and son. There, the gods offered him to Custer. 5 years later, when he was afield in Montana, a courier delivered a telegram containing the news that his wife had unexpectedly died. Reno turned over the unit to his senior captain and rode all night to Fort Benton, where he sent a telegram requesting permission to attend his wife's funeral. Headquarters replied, quote, "While fully sympathizing with your affliction, the department commander feels it's imperative to decline your grant you leave. You must return to your command." His wife came from a wealthy family, but they despised him and saw to it that he never got a dime. In 1876, after the Little Bighorn defeat, he returned to Fort Lincoln, but presently was given command of a wretched stronghold 30 miles south of Fargo called Fort Abercrombie. Here he ran afoul of a captain's wife, Mrs. Emmeline Bell. Her reputation was not good. Perhaps she was maligned. Today it is impossible to know. Reno himself, justifiably or not, compared her to a spoiled egg. How intimate they were is a matter of academic dispute. That he slid closer to her than he should have while the captain was absent is beyond doubt. That he accomplished much, if anything, seems very questionable. Whatever did or did not happen, his behavior caused gossip. He might have eased out of this delicate situation, except for the presence of an Episcopal missionary and longtime friend of the Bells, Reverend Richard Wainwright, who lodged at the captain's house. It appears that Wainwright was outraged by what he heard and persuaded the captain to file charges of immoral conduct. This being done, Reno was ordered to relinquish command of Fort Abercrombie and deliver himself up to his superiors at St. Paul, there to stand trial. And we will end there before we get into the trial of Reno. And I hope you guys are enjoying it, and we will be back shortly with another video. Bye, guys!